Well, good morning. Good morning. All right, we are all here. My name is Michael Atkins. Right. Whoa, where? Yes. My name is Michael Atkins. I'm the former principal of 7 Elementary. 7 folks in the house. I am the current director of Black Student Success, the DPS. And I just want to take a moment for us to all get grounded. I consider myself a journeyman with DPS. I tell everyone I've been part of the district in some capacity since I was 4 years old. So for all of my life, I've been part of the district. And I have various different experiences in the district. We'll do some storytelling today. But we're here for a specific reason. Some of the stories that you will hear today, some of the conversations that you will engage in, they could be quite heavy. Now, the reason we need to center ourselves is because we need to engage as authentic listeners today. You might be sitting with someone, next to someone with different lived experience, with different opinions. That is totally okay. I think oftentimes we work so hard to change someone's perception or opinions that we lose sight of what truly matters. So today we're going to be grounding ourselves in conversations of past experiences of kids, current experience of kids, and how can we be forward thinkers for our babies. So at this moment, I'm going to pass it over to my co-host.
Thank you, sir.
Andrew Lefkowitz.
Yes, thank you. My name is Andrew Lefkowitz. I'm the co-chair of Park Hill Neighbors for Equity in Education. Really, really grateful to you all for being here. Excited for all the things we have planned for the day. As Mike mentioned, we are the co-hosts for Integration and Equity in Denver Public Schools 50 years after Keys. So 50 years ago, almost 51 years ago, the Supreme Court determined that Denver Public Schools was violating the constitutional rights of its black and brown students by maintaining what they called a dual education system. Basically, an education system for white kids and a separate and inferior education system for students of color. This led to 22 years of court-ordered desegregation, including busing. It radically reshaped not just DPS, but the country as a whole. The impacts of the decision were wide-ranging, from the systems level all the way down to the personal level. The case set precedent at the Supreme Court that would go on to influence desegregation cases throughout the country. It caused an amendment to the Colorado State Constitution, and it exacerbated the massive demographic shifts that were happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s of mostly white families moving to the suburbs. It also created the era of busing, and that era had undeniable benefits and real costs. Busing decreased academic achievement gaps between white students and students of color. It increased access to resources for students of color, but it also destroyed many culturally affirming black schools, resulted in the loss of black teachers and school leaders, and frequently ended up sending students of color to schools with more resources, but also more hostility. All that to say, it was nuanced and complicated, but undeniably influential. And while the systems level impact is important, I think sometimes it's easy when we think about the system to forget about the kids, who are the most important part of the education system. So our focus today is on individual stories, is on people's personal experiences. The case changed the country, it changed the state, it changed the city, but more importantly, it changed the lives of students, parents, school leaders, school board members, and it continues to impact us all today. So why are Mike and I co-hosting this event? It is not because we have the same stylist. I'm sure you were wondering. But if you heard the Brother Jeff show the other day, he mentioned that John Bailey once referred to him as a Keys kid. Well, Mike and I are both Keys kids. We were both indelibly shaped by the Keys case. And the decisions that were made by state leaders, by educators, by teachers at that time planted a seed of conviction in both of us that led us to the work we do today. So I was raised in Park Hill. I went to Stedman, went to Smile East. You got any angels?
Whoop, whoop.
Hey, Lolo.
Hey, Lolo, hey, Lolo.
All right, all right. I know we're in Manuel, it's a little controversial, but the way the district was at the time really had an influence on me. Led me to this work that I do with PHNEE. Also led me to some national work I do with an organization called Integrated Schools, where I'm very fortunate to co-host a podcast called the Integrated Schools Podcast. We have hard, nuanced conversations about school integration, and it's really been a gift to me to be able to participate in that. So unquestionably, the ripples of the decisions that were made for me have had this huge impact in my life. And Mike shares a similar story.
I want you all to imagine showing up to work every single day. And being forced to hold a job, the same job, for 12, 13 years. But in year one, you understand that people around you, they don't like you, they don't see you, and it's a hostile environment. This is what we ask babies to do every single day. Be resilient, show up to work. You might not be seen, you might not be heard, you might not feel loved, but you gotta show up to work. And if you don't, there are punitive consequences. I can remember that moment. I understood I had to show up to work, and I wasn't loved. I remember getting off the bus my 6th grade year, standing in line. It's a new school. They're heading into the building. It was raining outside, early fall day. And I remember walking past my gym teacher, and she's talking to her colleague, and she says, "Here comes the bus kids." At the time, it was so matter of fact, I didn't think anything of it. But I would learn through my experience the next 3 years that "here comes the bus kids" meant something totally different. So what happens when you are forced to go to a space where you're not seen, not heard, you're not loved? I grew to hate school. Waking up every morning was a chore. Spending 8 hours, 30 minutes on the bus to, 30 minutes on the bus home, and then spending 7 hours in a building where I didn't feel seen and or loved. And some very shining moments in personal relationships came out of that time. Some of my best friends I met in that building that weren't from the same neighborhood I was from. But what was lacking was the intercultural development of our educators. To truly understand that the ask shouldn't be for our babies to assimilate to school. It should be, how are we shifting our culture to the students that are in front of us? These same things are occurring right now in our schools, our implicit, explicit biases. So when Andrew says we are Keys kids, it's because it shaped us. It has shaped our why. It has shaped our determination. It has even shifted the way that we parent and the decisions that we make in our communities.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So as you can see, we're going to dig in. We're going to go heavy here. There's going to be a lot of conversation. A couple of quick disclaimers before we really dive in for real. This event is called Integration and Equity. The word integration is a loaded term. It carries a lot of historical trauma. It carries a lot of baggage. And we have to acknowledge that. But what we want to do is identify a new vision for integration. The way that we think about integration is separate from desegregation. So desegregation was a question of moving bodies around. It was about numerical, what percentage of kids at what school are which race. We think of integration as finding new forms of shared power, as creating new systems that recognize everybody's humanity, that acknowledge the full humanity of everyone and allow them to show up as their full selves in a truly integrated place that makes us all richer.
I think when we think about disclaimers as well, Andrew, let's all ground in that white children aren't this amazing special gift to education, and that our babies aren't born with an achievement gap. Let's also ground in there is power in for us, by us, in monocultural spaces, right? In affinity groups, right? There is power in that. So in no way, shape, or form is this saying that those should not exist, because identity in spaces where we feel safe, seen and heard, are extremely important. Let's also think about this from the perspective of we all have something to bring to the table, right? And we all have a personal responsibility to ignite exactly what Andrew said around we all have some skin in the game there, right?
Yes, I mean, I couldn't say it better, but I do think there is one person who maybe could say it better. So in 1974, Thurgood Marshall, in his dissenting opinion in the Milliken v. Bradley case, had this to say.
Our nation, I fear, will be ill-served by this court's refusal to remedy separate and unequal education, for unless our children begin to learn together, there is little hope that our people will ever learn to live together and understand each other.
There is little hope that our people will ever learn to live together and understand each other. That's got to be modeled at the highest level, right? Because when the tires hit the road, we are all sharing this space together.
Yeah, and we are not the first people to think of this, right? Mike and I did not come up with the idea. Obviously, in 1974, Thurgood Marshall was talking about it. This is work that has been generational work, right? We stand here on the shoulders of giants, people who saw injustice and decided to do something about it, right? Even if that thing wasn't easy, even if that thing was dangerous, even if it came at great cost to themselves or to their families, and even if they didn't know if it was going to be successful in their lifetimes. People who chose to be part of the long battle, right? The work of bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice. In 1969, one of those people was Dr. Wilfred Keyes. He joined with 7 other families to sue DPS for violating the equal protection rights of their children, and did so knowing that there was potentially great cost to that. But I think he believed that it was worth it. But you don't have to take my word for it. It is my deep honor and privilege to bring to the stage someone with direct experience of that. Please welcome the great Miss Christy Keyes Romero. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
For agreeing to do this. I know this is not your favorite thing to do, so we are grateful that you were willing to do it.
Oh, okay.
I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit of your story. I know you grew up in Park Hill. You went to Hallett.
Yes.
You went to Smiley. You went to GW.
Right.
Okay, easy.
I know, they got a bad rap now.
A little dangerous in this room. What was your schooling experience like growing up?
Well, I actually started off at Mitchell.
Oh, okay.
I grew up over here. I was born on 28th and Humboldt.
There you are.
Close by, yeah. So I would say we moved to Park Hill when I was probably 8, And my mom was at Mitchell as a teacher's aide. So we stayed there for the end of the school year. Then I did go to, Howard. So then, of course, I went to Smiley, but I wasn't bused. So I still got to go to my neighborhood school.
Right.
The buses were coming in to where I was going to school. So I probably didn't experience like what the principal said about going into the schools
Another school.
out. Yeah, it was different for me. I didn't see any, and I'm older than you guys. So I didn't see that.
A little bit.
But anyway, then I was bused to GW.
Yeah. Can we talk about your parents a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
We've got a beautiful picture of them up there. Dr. I want to hold a little space for your mom. I know she just passed away in October. I think she would have been 98 just a week or two ago.
Yeah, February 1st.
Yeah. I think somebody in the registration said that they had her as a teacher.
Oh, really? Yes.
I don't know if that person's here, but
long,
lots
fabulous life.
Lots of connections. Yeah. Your dad had to walk past a white school to get to his black school.
Yes, my dad was from Kansas City, Missouri. So that was one of the, I would say, originally what made him feel like he did about the education system is because he experienced walking past a white school to get to his school in elementary, and it was pretty segregated, I would say, probably in Kansas City.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, my mom was born in Western Kansas, and she was the only black all the way through school. So they grew up totally different from each other, But they came together when it comes to the lawsuit and the equal opportunity for all children.
Was that what motivated your dad? He found that every kid deserved equal opportunity.
I would have to say definitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
It wasn't easy. Can we talk about almost exactly 54 years ago, February 24th, 1970?
You're right.
There's a picture from the paper. Your house was firebombed.
Right. Yeah. I was at Howard when that happened, when the house was bombed down. And at that time, there were several bombings around the city that were going on. The school buses got bombed, and so one evening, sitting at the table, dining room table, I was doing my homework. I heard something bump at the door, and told my dad, thought it was our dog. And he looked over at the door. We had just moved, we hadn't been up in that home long. So it had a door with a window at that time where you could see. And he goes to the door, he sees the smoke, and right away, he said it's a firebomb. So then he pushes us all to the back of the house, and he goes around to the front. He tries to go to the front of the house with a pot of water to throw on the firebomb. Before he could get to it, it went off a couple of times and blew out everybody's window next to us, ours, and it was just the most scary thing. But the funny thing about it, which is really not funny, is the guy that bombed our house came in there right after the bomb went off to see if we were okay. The next morning, when the detectives come out, my parents were in shock, evidently. They didn't even remember this man coming in. And he said he lived across the street. At that time, we had no white neighbors across the street, so I remembered that the next morning. And also saw what he drove off in. So they bought mug shots in, and this guy, I identified him, got subpoenaed to court as a child, and he went to prison. I don't know anything other than that, but so that was a bad, that was a bad, I think I probably have PTSD still from that, to be honest.
No question. Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Jump all the time.
Right. People were willing to go to great lengths to fight
Great
drive for equity.
Yeah.
I like to think we're past the days of firebombing, but we're certainly not past the days of people fighting hard against equity, against integration, against. You're now re-entering the education system with your grandchildren.
Yeah, well, I have one coming.
You got a grandchild on the way.
So, yes, I actually will be, and I'm a DPS person, so that's what they'll, I'm hoping.
Yeah, what do you want people to know, or what do you want people to do after hearing your story?
Well, to don't talk about it. Do something about it.
Yeah.
Over the years, we keep talking about it. I'm actually tired of talking about it, to be honest, but it needs to be talked about. But I think people need to step up. And, and there are, I think it's coming slowly, slowly. Hopefully, since I will be having a grandchild, I'll be able to engage and get deeper into it also as well, When you don't have children in the school system, you kind of get laxed, which is not good either.
That's right.
But yeah, so
Yeah.
I would say, just keep the drive, keep thinking these children of all colors, especially the brown children, keep them in mind. They need equal, same as everybody.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
We're going to discuss in a little bit that the district is now basically as segregated as it was back in the 60s before your dad began the fight.
Yeah.
He jumped in with both feet, maybe sort of dragged your mom along with him a little bit.
Yeah.
But, do you think his fight was worth it? Do you think your family's fight was worth it?
Oh, I think it was definitely worth it. Yeah, I think it was worth it. Even though it's regressed and it's not like it was, but because there were people that benefited from it, for sure.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to people off and on. I'm a CNA, and I've been a CNA for over 30 years. And I do home care, so I've run into all kind of people over the years that tell me they benefited from it. They're a little bit older than me, went to GW, I'm talking about white people that told me. Yeah, most of the black people got negative stuff.
That's understandable.
Have a lot of negative,
Yeah, we talked about that. Well, I am certainly one of those people who benefited from it. I am so grateful for your family, for their sacrifice. It wasn't easy, but I think we're certainly a better city for it, and your family played a big part in that. And I'm really grateful for you agreeing to do this.
Well, thank you.
Speaking of family, I have mentioned the choices that my parents made a few times. They had a big impact on me, obviously. I started at Stedman Elementary. My parents got involved. My dad was actually the PTA co-president with Riola Phelps, who's here, who you'll meet here shortly. And my mom got more and more engaged, as people do, and eventually decided to run for school board. She was elected in 1995 and served for 4 years. She actually handed me my diploma when I graduated from East in '96, which was pretty awesome. And so it is my distinct honor to turn the program over to her. She's going to give us some history, and she's going to introduce our first panel. She has specifically asked me not to call her mom, so I will hand the floor over to you, Mrs. Lefkowitz.
Thank you, son. Well, I am here to tell the story of the Keys case from my point of view. It's a story that, for me anyway, in some ways begins at the end. In May of '95, I was elected to the Denver School Board as an at-large member. As Andrew said, my journey towards service had to do with getting involved in my local school. The Stedman boundaries had changed the year before Andrew started in school. As a result of the court order, the district was able to de-pair schools that had previously been paired for busing if the enrollment in the boundary offered a sufficient amount of desegregation. And this is what happened with Stedman. Previously, our house had been zoned for Park Hill Elementary, but the boundaries were changed, and Andrew went to Stedman, where he was in a distinct minority of white kids. So we sent him, later our daughter Erin went there, and it was in part because of the opportunity it would provide him to go to school with kids who were not like him, who were different from him. And I'm happy to say that our children send their children to Stedman today. Yeah. So during the campaign, I was asked about my views on busing only once that I could recall. It was 1995. It was not a topic of discussion in the community at that time. According to a Denver Post article, I said, well, I believed in the principles of desegregation, and I expressed my concern that without a court order, we might return to the inequitable schools of the 60s. As I recall, no other candidates shared this view. They asserted that the school district had moved on from those dark days of the 50s and 60s and 70s, and it was simply important to provide a high-quality education for everyone. This was the prevailing view of the public at the time. So although I maintained my belief in the value of integration in all aspects of life, I didn't emphasize this on the campaign trail because I wanted to win. So it was quite a shock when on the morning of September 12th, 1995, 4 months after I had been sworn in, the DPS attorney, Michael Jackson, walked into a meeting and said, "It's over." And with those two words, Jackson confirmed that the district court judge, Richard Maich, had ended the 26-year saga of federal court-ordered desegregation of the Denver public schools by declaring that DPS had removed the past vestiges of discrimination to the extent practicable. There was much hoopla in the administration building that day. Administrators breathed a sigh of relief to have the onerous burden of federal control off their backs. And although I couldn't know it at the time how truly significant this development was going to be for the district and for my term on the board, I knew that what I thought was ahead for me when I was elected was probably going to take a back seat to this, and how right I was. So today I have the unenviable task of describing in 20 minutes, although we're already 20 minutes behind schedule, I might talk faster. I'm going to describe the history of this long and complex case. My part in it, as I said, came only at the end, and fortunately for us, there are others of us with us today who will be part of our panel discussion, who literally lived the case. You've already heard from the lead plaintiff's daughter, Christy Romero, and we're also going to hear from Buddy Knoll, the son of Rachel B. Knoll, the school board member whose resolution led to the filing of the case. Dr. Pat Pasco is another panelist who's written the only full-length book about the history of the case. And Dr. Kathy Escamilla, member of the Congress of Hispanic Educators who intervened in the case on behalf of English language learners, is also with us. So clearly any one of these folks could do a better job than what I'm about to do, but for the sake of time, I'm going to whip through the high points of this case. Andrew pointed out on your table in our resources section, we have both an online timeline of the case and a PDF pamphlet describing the case if you like reading it better that way. But in the timeline, it's clear that activism among African Americans in Denver began at the founding of the city of Denver and the state, long before this case. But for our purposes, we're going to start in the 1950s and 60s with the famous 5 Points neighborhood of Denver. Home to most of Denver's Black population at the time, it began to burst at the seams, driving many homeowners there to areas like North City Park and eventually Park Hill. And they were in search of more space, trees, yards, all the things that most Americans look for in their lives. This migration had profound effects on the demographics of Park Hill. By 1966, changing the once all-white neighborhood of Park Hill into one with over a third of its population being Black. And by 1970, Northeast Park Hill changed from less than 4% African American to over 87% Black. And of course, the schools were affected as well. So as this migration is happening, what does the DPS school board do? Well, it responds in ways, all of which had the effect of maintaining the racial isolation that had existed. White families were offered discretionary transfers from predominantly Black schools to predominantly white schools, and mobile classrooms were added to some Black schools to address overcrowding. Here's a picture of trailers on the playground of Smith Elementary at 35th and Jasmine. This was a reality that you could see with your own eyes that undermined the district's persistent assertion that they were not discriminating when it came to assigning children to schools. So the community began to protest not only the racial isolation, but the obvious differences in facilities, materials, and teacher qualifications between Black and white schools. So one overt act the district took was to build a new school to address overcrowding. This new school, Barrett Elementary, located on the west side of Colorado Boulevard at 29, opened in 1960 to much fanfare about shiny new desks in an up-to-date facility. The school's boundaries, though, guaranteed a student population that was 95% Black. And the shiny new building couldn't disguise the features common to a so-called Black school: less experienced teachers, substandard curriculum, and materials. The school also had the effect of eliminating transfers to Park Hill Elementary that had been made available to students north of City Park who were assigned to Black schools. As we'll talk about later, Buddy Knoll was one of those students who had been transferred to Park Hill, as was his sister, Angela. But when Barrett opened, Angela was moved from Park Hill to Barrett, where her fourth grade curriculum was essentially the same as what she had learned in third grade at Park Hill. Many school administrators at the time justified this, and I could quote them, but I won't, that this kind of discrepancy was necessary because they believed Black children were unlikely to attend college and so did not need the same curriculum as white children. In 1965, spurred in part by her daughter's experience at Barrett, Buddy and Angela's mother, Rachel Bassett Knoll, ran for and was elected to the Denver School Board as its first African American member. And this launched a lifetime of public service by Mrs. Knoll focused on equity in education. In 1963, before Mrs. Knoll joined the board adopted a resolution talking about equality of opportunity. It was Resolution 5100, and it said, quote, DPS recognizes that the continuation of neighborhood schools has resulted in the concentration of some minority racial and ethnic groups in some schools. Reduction of such concentration and the establishment of more heterogeneous or diverse groups in school is desirable to achieve equality of educational opportunity. The resolution was strong, but it did not require any action, and so no action ensued. But in April of 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Mrs. Knoll's frustration at the lack of action on Resolution 5100 boiled over, and she, along with her colleague Ed Benton, whose daughter Margaret is here with us today, happy to say, wrote Resolution 1490, now known famously as the Knoll Resolution. Referring to the goal of equality of educational opportunities set forth in 5100, the Knoll Resolution directed the superintendent to create a comprehensive plan for the integration of the district schools. The clause of the resolution that most captured the public's attention required the superintendent to address segregation through, quote, the use of transportation and the extent to which transportation should be voluntary or mandatory. But the resolution is actually much more than that. Its 4 pages constitute, in my view, a powerful treatise on the social and political environment at the time, and an acknowledgement of the deep divisions within the community regarding racial integration. It refers to the assassination of Dr. King that has, quote, focused the attention of concerned people of goodwill upon the deep and festering injustices of modern urban existence, with its contradictions of opportunity and achievement, in an America dedicated, at least in theory, to the equality of opportunity for all men. The resolution acknowledged the fears in the community about the possible busing for integration and asserts the board's desire to act as a unifying agency for Denver in these difficult times. It is this last hope, perhaps more than anything, that was least realized in the years to come. The Knoll resolution was passed by the board 5-2, and while welcomed by some, was derided by many others. The 1969 board election focused almost exclusively on the busing issue. And with 2 at-large seats up for election, the balance of power between the pro and anti-integration sentiment was at stake. Ed Benton, running for re-election, was joined by Monty Pasco, Pat's husband, who's here today, in the fight to secure seats for the integrationists. Frank Southworth and James Perrell emerged as the anti-integration candidates. Despite winning by 3-1 in the Park Hill neighborhood, Benton and Pasco lost 2-1 citywide, flipping the board majority from the pro to the anti-integration status. So, at its first meeting in May of 1969, the new board immediately overturned the integration resolutions that had resulted from the Knoll resolution. By the way, the Knoll resolution and Resolution 5100 have never been overturned. They are still on the books today. I'm actually not sure how many current board members are aware of that. At this point, Dr. Wilfred Keyes, who you heard of, and 7 other families joined forces to sue the district for denial of equal educational opportunity for their children. They asked for the desegregation of students and teachers, for the equalization of resources among the schools, for the elimination of tracking, and for racial sensitivity training for teachers. The next 4 years would see political and legal turmoil unlike anything the city had seen before. Gordon Greiner, the plaintiff's dogged attorney, with support from the firm Holland and Hart, our generous sponsor today, led the effort against the recalcitrance of the district. Gordon, as you can see, was quite a character and an unlikely choice for this role, having been, I think, an antitrust lawyer, but he embraced it and actually moved his family to Park Hill. As various judges ruled for or against the plaintiffs, each side appealed to higher courts until ultimately an appeal was heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in October of 1972. The case, known as Keyes versus School District Number 1, was decided in favor of the plaintiffs in May of 1973. It's notable nationally for 3 main precedents. First, the court ruled that Black and Latino, called at that time Negro and Hispano, students, quote, suffer the same educational inequities when compared with the treatment afforded Anglo white students. And therefore, schools with a combined predominance of Negroes and Hispanos can be assumed to be segregated. This ruling made the Keyes case the first tri-ethnic desegregation case in the nation. The role of Latinos in desegregation was complicated by a number of factors, particularly the need for bilingual education, which was not provided in every school in DPS. Ultimately, a group of educators, known as the Congress of Hispanic Educators, intervened in the case to ensure equal opportunities for the growing Latino population. This part of the case was not resolved in 1995 and is still active, and we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Kathy Escamilla, who will tell us more about that. The second significant ruling in Keyes was that proof that a school district has intentionally segregated a significant part of the district, such as Park Hill, supports a finding that the district operates an unconstitutional dual system with one education for whites and another for students of color. In this case, the entire school district is subject to remedy, not just the areas focused on in the case. And finally, the precedent was that a school district that has never been operated under a constitutional or statutory provision permitting segregation can still act in a way that requires them to desegregate. This last precedent was important because the Denver case was the first case in a northern city, and segregation was not imposed by law, as it was in the South, or de jure is the term, but functionally many schools were as segregated as those in the South as a result of school board policies. The district's defense was that desegregation in Denver was de facto, meaning it was simply a result of the demographics of the neighborhood, or it happened in fact, and that it had nothing to do with what they did. But the Supreme Court rejected this argument, citing numerous discriminatory acts of policy by the DPS board, including the construction and student assignment plan of Barrett Elementary. And so they said the district had in fact been segregated de jure, and thus was subject to the same remedies used in Southern cases. And this determination paved the way for similar cases filed in other northern cities. The Supreme Court remanded the case to the district court to determine if in fact DPS was a dual system. But the finding by Judge Doyle, who was the judge at the time, that this was the case, the district court ordered a citywide desegregation plan to go into place. So what was the reaction in the city to these rulings? As we heard earlier, Dr. Keyes' house was bombed, as was the bus depot, the DPS bus depot, where 40% of the district's buses were burned and no longer usable. Anti-busing organizations emerged and were instrumental in passing an anti-busing amendment to the Colorado Constitution, which prohibited busing for the purpose of achieving a racial balance in a school. The amendment did not apply to Denver while the case was ongoing and while the district was under federal control. The court order, along with national trends towards suburbanization, had a dramatic effect on enrollment in DPS. In the first decade, from 69 to 79, DPS lost over 30,000 students, reducing enrollment from about 96,000 to 65,000. Demographics changed as well, as you can see. In 69, about 65% of DPS students were white. By 79, the proportion of white students had dropped to about 42%. And in 95, when the court order ended, only about 28% of students were white. By then, half of all students were Latino. In the late 80s and 90s, boards attempted to attract more students by providing voluntary integration opportunities, such as through the development of magnet schools. Schools like the Denver School of the Arts, Mitchell Montessori, Knight Fundamental Academy, and the George Washington International Baccalaureate Program. These schools were strategically placed in neighborhoods to draw students from other races to them. They were allowed to accept students on the basis of their race for integration purposes, and transportation was provided through a federal grant. A turning point in the Denver case came in '93 when Wellington Webb, Denver's first African-American mayor, filed an amicus brief in support of DPS's request for the case to end and to be free from federal control. Mayor Webb asserted that busing hadn't worked and that it was more important for children to be in their own neighborhood schools supporting their own communities. Webb himself represented a change in political leadership since the 1960s, as did the district superintendent at the time, Dr. Evie Dennis, who was also Black. Webb's brief asserted that it was absurd to believe that now powerful minorities would allow discrimination to take place as it had in the past. So 2 years later, in 1995, Judge Richard Mach, who had taken over the case by then, seemed to agree. I see Mach's ruling as a white flag of surrender in the long fight for integration, in explaining that it was only necessary for the district to remedy past discrimination caused by segregation, not to integrate the schools, and emphasizing that although segregation was outlawed, integration was not the required remedy. The judge said the district had eliminated the vestiges of discrimination to the extent practicable. The judge also expressed his view on the post-racial nature of Denver of the 90s compared to the 60s. Perhaps he had been influenced by Mayor Webb when he wrote, "The Denver now before this court is very different from what it was when this lawsuit began. People of color are not bystanders. They are active players in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the community. There is little danger that they will permit the public schools to deny them full participation." Of course, people of color had never been bystanders, as evidenced by the case itself. Nevertheless, the ideal espoused by Justice Thurgood Marshall that you heard earlier, that children need to learn together in order to live together and understand one another, was not the major focus of public discourse at the time. So after only 4 months of service on the board, I and my colleagues were faced with reconstructing the district after over 20 years of federal control. The main issue we struggled with was the anti-busing amendment, which now applied to Denver. Although Judge Mach asserted that the amendment would not require us to change our student assignment plan, the Attorney General at the time, Gail Norton, said publicly that she intended to enforce the amendment fully, but that because the school year was already underway, we would have a year to relocate schools. And so we moved forward with the student assignment plan that is still in place today. We redrew neighborhood school boundaries in order to give every child a guaranteed seat in a neighborhood school, while attempting to preserve as much integration as possible in a city with segregated housing. Many schools did not have sufficient capacity to accommodate all its neighborhood children. In some cases, magnet schools were taking up space and they needed to be moved. We struggled with all these decisions. Ultimately, in every case, creating capacity for neighborhood schools won out, magnets were moved, and capital funds were spent on expansions and remodels to bring kids back to a nearby school. By the way, these neighborhood school boundaries, redrawn in 1995-96, are for the most part still in place today. The district has not addressed boundaries for the city as a whole since 1995. And the next part of our plan was, for the first time, we allowed children to attend any school in the district they wished, as long as there was sufficient space after neighborhood children had been enrolled, and importantly, as long as they could provide their own transportation. This was the beginning of the choice process you're all familiar with today. Next, we created what were called special transportation zones, an attempt to preserve the integration that already existed in some schools by allowing children to continue attending their current school with transportation provided, an option many families chose, but only for a few years. And finally, in recognition of the fact that this new student assignment plan would undoubtedly resulted in many more schools with high concentrations of students in greater need. We revised the formula by which funds were allocated to individual schools from the district's overall budget in order to provide greater, though I would argue inadequate still, equity. This equity-based allocation formula is still in place today, although with some modifications, and is still inadequate today. And so, with newer remodeled facilities, extra funds targeted to the different needs of children in each school, a neighborhood school for everyone, and the freedom to choose other options, we felt that we had done the best job we could to ensure equality of opportunity in the post-court order new normal. It's only in retrospect that I have come to question some of these policies. We'll talk about that later. So this story from 30,000 feet leaves so much out. For example, research and personal anecdotes have shown that there were many positive effects of the integration that occurred in the 70s and 80s, with higher student achievement among students of color and a reduction of prejudice in all students who participated. This is a book I would recommend by Rucker Johnson called Children of the Dream, making that case. But as Andrew and Mike both mentioned earlier, we also know that students of color were often faced with an unwelcoming environment in the schools to which they were bused, and Black teachers lost jobs when the district chose to eliminate them from the so-called white schools. Today, as we will hear later, our district is more segregated than ever. We will discuss how that ongoing segregation impacts students today. But for now, I hope this brief overview provides us with a common understanding of what happened from 1969 to 1995 and why. And with that, we're going to turn to our esteemed panel. Thank you very much. We're so fortunate to have three great panelists who know the history of the case. And I'm going to ask a question to each of them, and then we're going to have some discussion among all of us. And it will not be an adequate amount of time for all the knowledge that they have to share, but we'll do our best. Buddy, let's start with you. Buddy Knoll is the son of Rachel B. Knoll, who was instrumental in the case. He tells us he's a surrogate for his mother, and he would speak for her, and we appreciate that. But you've been practicing law for over 50 years, and you have your own first to lay claim to. You were the first Black partner at Holm, Roberts & Owens in 1977. That's how long it took for a major law firm in Denver to have a Black partner. It's very impressive. And even though you weren't a lawyer on the Keyes case, you have a lot to share about the Keyes case. For example, both your sister, Angela, and you were impacted by the manipulation of school boundaries that I talked about earlier. You and Angela attended Park Hill, but Angela was moved from there to Barrett when that school opened, and this event sort of radicalized your mother and motivated her to get involved. So just tell us, what was it about this experience that was so profound for her and for your family?
That's not an easy response to make if you realize that I was a small child. I was a fifth, sixth grader. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't studied history. I had talked to many people with interviews and academicians. I was a kid. Sometimes we forget when we look back how much we ask children to do. Michael has forced us to think again about that today. The lawyer in me, of course, wants a table and wants to have my materials laid out in front of me instead of on my lap. But before I answer the question, I want to do two things. I want to make sure that you read this book. Pat Pasco has not only created an historical account of what happened, but she has told the story of the people on the ground. And you read a Supreme Court case, 30,000 feet, maybe 100,000 feet. It has summarized the facts to such a degree that you hardly wonder what really happened to the people on the ground. It may thoroughly discuss legal issues related to those facts, but the real story of us and ours from before gets told in this book, and I highly recommend
Thank you very much.
that you read it. Of course, in addition, Pat and I are connected in many ways, but Monty, and my mother, I was a child at their knees. As I grew older, I was still a child at their knees, learning from them. And Monty and I had a connection through Dartmouth College. So you should know, as I'm telling Pat, I wore my Dartmouth College tie today. Another book I can't recommend too much is the 40th anniversary study of the Keyes case, a symposium done at by DU's Law Review folks that brought constitutional scholars from around the country, who then, after the symposium was concluded, many wrote their papers in this compendium by the Law Review. If you want more history, if you want more details, Pat's book and this 40th anniversary treatment of the Keyes case is really good reading. So why would I be here other than to just be Mom's surrogate? And if I say something beyond my own personal knowledge, it's because I was at Mom's knee or Ed and Monty's knee to hear her say some things that I would extrapolate today to say, maybe that's what Mom would say. But I was a personal part of the early days of starting the Keyes case. Fact history. We grew up on 22nd and Vine, and I went to Wyman through kindergarten through 5th grade. Then my father built a house at 26th Avenue in Adams for my 6th grade year. That was one block inside of a special optional district. 99% white parents and children who didn't want to go to Columbine but preferred to go to Park Hill Elementary through this special optional busing plan. So I ended up as one or two black kids on a bus that was set up for white kids to escape to Park Hill. My mother saw what that dramatic difference was. For me, it was that Janice Metcalf wore a different dress every day, and I thought she was the prettiest girl I'd ever seen. But in addition to that, my teacher, Miss Elsa Glessner, was fabulous. And to this day, she's made whatever difference in my educational performance from 6th grade forward. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse in North Dakota before she came to Denver. And years later, when Colorado started the first Teacher of the Year award, she was the first recipient. So I went from whatever I was in terms of educational opportunity at Wyman, which I'm not denigrating at all, to something quite special at Park Hill. Maybe it's all just happenstance, maybe it's not. In any case, what I saw was a difference in how children were treated. When the bus was all white, the busing schedule got us there early enough in the morning that we could intermingle with the other kids. In fact, they'd hardly know we were bus kids because we're all getting there at the same time. After school, the bus left late enough that some of my 6th grade friends are still my friends today. We could get in trouble after school together. The busing schedule accommodated us simply being students in school because it was primarily white. 3 or 4 years later, my sister, 4 years younger, by the time she's there in her 3rd grade year, the bus arrives right before school. The students get in line and file to the auditorium, where they stay at the auditorium until the bell rings. There's no intermingling with the other students. After school, they go straight to the auditorium. They don't leave the auditorium until they're all there to file straight to the bus to go home. Just that slight level of difference in social contact, kids having a chance to be kids. It's one indication of what the design, the architecture of the busing plan itself did to create the system that we had to change. We got beer and cigarettes to the soldiers in Vietnam. We could move a few students around so they could just be students. As you pointed out, maybe the reason the court was willing to make a de facto ruling was they had such a strong piece of the system that was a de jure ruling. And my little piece of the story is only a little piece, but I did live it, and I did see it. And my sister then, when she, one of the first students at Barrett, saw it as well, because as a fourth grader, she was repeating the same work that she had done as a third grader. And my mother, of course, never told me I'm incensed, but I know my mother and father, as I talked to them later, could not believe that the school administrators would do something like that. Of course, these are the same people that put in charge of making a court-ordered busing plan work. Small wonder that was a problem. Anyway.
Thank you, Buddy. Thanks. Pat,
That was me. Sorry.
not only did you live through the case, you wrote the book, as we talked about, you also served as a state senator in the Colorado General Assembly. Many, many accomplishments in your life. But at this time, you had children in the Denver Public Schools, and your husband, Monty, as we said, ran for the school board in 1969. I think my husband can probably relate to how much not fun it is to have a spouse running for the Denver children. And your children, my children said. But you also voluntarily sent your kids from Dora Moore Elementary to Hallett, a predominantly black school at the time, to help integrate Hallett. And you even prepared for personal threats to your safety at home to fight for this cause. Tell us about your motivation. Why were you willing to put yourself and your family through all of that?
Thank you, Laura, for asking me to speak. I usually don't speak any shorter than 45 minutes.
Oh.
But I promise.
We're going to cut your mic off.
But Monty and I both believe that every child should have an equal educational opportunity. And we have a deep sense of justice. Monty was a Park Hill Boy Scout. He went to Park Hill, Spivey, and East. I would like to just make a few major points because they're snippets from my 45-minute speech. First of all, the law. The decision, Plessy v. Ferguson, was the standard for to have separate but equal facilities. You could have separate facilities for minorities, but they had to be equal to facilities for white people. And that was the law until 1954 in the Brown decision, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Equal facilities were not enough because segregation is a violation of the 14th Amendment. About minority children, the Supreme Court said, quote, to separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. Even if there's very little public support for desegregation, the law requires it. The Constitution requires it. People in discussing the history say, well, we tried desegregation, it didn't work. That's wrong. It did work. It established and validated constitutional equality under the law. and validated equal educational opportunity that existed in the schools. If the board had put its full faith and credit into it, it would have had a much greater effect. Rachel Noel thought desegregation was poorly implemented by the school board. Local and national studies show the benefits of integration. And they're all cited in the book. But one important citation is the NAEP test. NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's been given since the 70s. Even the very same questions are given. And they found that 17-year-old black children reduced the gap, the learning gap, between blacks and whites, excuse me, by about 50%. The mathematics gap was reduced by 25%, and the science gap by 15%. This was at the period of 20 years when there was the most desegregation in the whole country. One other point about Tom Bosberg, who was the superintendent, recognized the great gains that were made during the court order, and then the fall back into the large gaps again right after the end of the court order. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah. So far, we've been talking about the case from the perspective of the African American cause, but Kathy, you are a professor emerita of education in the Division of Equity, Bilingualism, and Biliteracy at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and you're an expert on the development of bilingualism and biliteracy for Spanish-speaking children. You came on the scene a bit later than Buddy and Pat and were an advisor to the Che intervention in the case. Can you tell us what were the objectives of the intervention? How did they relate to the initial Keys case, and why were you invested in the case?
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. And I would like to thank you for inviting me to be here. And you might be wondering, what the heck are you doing here? So I am not from Denver. I've never worked in Denver. I grew up in rural Colorado. I remember watching on television, black and white television, the history, what do I want to say? The violent and at times scary history of desegregation in the Denver public schools. And I was a nerd. I was a kid who loved school. And in my rural school district, we only had one school bus. And so when I heard about the school buses being blown up, I was like, oh my God, that means I couldn't go to school. Where my brother was like, hey, wouldn't that be great? So different perspectives on the same event. So how did I get involved and what am I doing here? People who know me, and I know a lot of you, and it's good to see you. I'm an old-time metiche, which is a word in Spanish for a Budinsky. Some kind of person. So in 1984, I was actually hired to come to Denver. I lived in Tucson, Arizona at the time because that was the first round of teacher education programs after the consent decree that protected the rights of bilingual kids was handed down by Judge Mage. And there were mandatory teacher education workshops. And so at that time, I met a woman named Dr. Marta Urioste, who was longtime leader and president of Che. We forged a 50-year mentorship, partnership, friendship from that point on. And when I moved to Colorado, she said, we need an educational advisor for Che, and you're it. She didn't ask if I wanted to do it. She didn't ask if I was qualified to do it. She didn't ask if I knew much more than what I had seen on television in the 1960s. So that's how I got to be part of Che. And so I've been part of the work daily, weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, mostly daily since then. I do want to say a word about Che and a word about their involvement in the Keys case and say that I talked to a few people in preparation for today. So the Congress for Hispanic Educators became an official, and the word official, it was called the Chicano Advocacy Group and Civil Rights Organization in 1974 at a conference in Vail. So if I use the words Chicano, Latino, Hispanic, interchangeably is because that's the way they are in the history of these cases. Our organization was founded in Vail, Colorado, tough gig. They had a conference up there. And the first president was Dr. Antonio Esquivel Sr., who continues to be an advisor to Che right now. Che became a plaintiff intervener in the case and self-defined, and listen to this because I just admire so much the people who were willing and courageous enough to risk their own personal safety, their own professional livelihoods in service to this cause. And I don't think that we can forget that. It's easy for people of my age to read the history and go, man, that's too bad, or that's wonderful. But it's a whole nother thing to put yourself in what it must have felt like to be Christy and have your, all of a sudden go to your back door and see that it's a smoke bomb. So I want to say a bit about Che, because they were composed of, and this is a quote from the actual case, they were composed largely of Chicano teachers, counselors, and staff employed by DPS. These were people who challenged their own employers, their own livelihood. These were people who were first-generation college graduates who needed a job. They weren't trust fund babies. And they were teachers, and we all know that teachers don't earn enough money. So I just want to shout that out. They were the plaintiff interveners in the case, and at a particular point in time, it wasn't that they separated. They became plaintiff interveners because they realized that their cause was a little bit different. And I briefly just describe why. Because in the course of events, it became clear that in busing, kids who were in schools with bilingual programs were being bused from those schools to schools with no bilingual programs. So the community had fought so hard to have the few bilingual programs that were in the district, and all of a sudden their kids were no longer the beneficiaries of them. But I do want to say, though, that it was not an acrimonious history. Everyone I've talked to said, we owe so much to the Keys plaintiffs. And so when I brought a few things to quote from, that the cause for Che was pro-Chicano, not anti-Keys. And that's very clear in all of the legal briefs and very clear in the history. And that they followed by saying that they no way intended to impede or delay relief in the Keys case, but intended only to ensure effective relief for their community. And so at the time that the Keys case was first handed down, basically the judge said there are two aspects to this, and acknowledged the complexity of the triethnic nature of the consent decree. That it was actually it was much more complicated than a simple binary that was black-white, that it was complex. And the position of Che was never specifically pro-busing, but it was always pro-integration. And it was having the needs met of children. At that time, sadly, in the Denver public schools, there were people who were adamantly opposed to any form of bilingual education. This is America, we speak English here. Kids who come to school must learn English. At times they got punished for speaking Spanish. You all know that history, I don't have to repeat it. But that was a form of discrimination that the interveners were actively trying to do something about in all kinds of ways. In conclusion, I want to say you don't hear that today. So you kind of hear people taking up the cause. Isn't bilingualism beautiful? Isn't biliteracy beautiful? Shouldn't all of our kids be bilingual? And I kind of go, yes, but. And so yes, but means, do we have the teachers? Do we have the facilities? Do we have the materials? Are we taking care of the kids we need to take care of first? Not saying that we shouldn't be doing other things, but saying we need to remember who it is that we're here to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to each of you. You each told the story you wanted to tell, and I appreciate that. We are going to I'm just going to open it up for a few more comments and give you a chance to share whatever you want to share, respond to your other panelists if you'd like to, and know that you're all going to have more time to talk as we go forward. Kathy, do you want to Go right
me
ahead.
first. Okay, so stuff I didn't get to say first, I'm going to say. I think that a lot has been written and said about white flight, but not enough has been written and said about, at the same time, the exponential growth of the Latino population in the Denver public schools. So yes, white people left, but Latinos stayed. And Latinos stayed and had kids and sent kids to the Denver public schools, and they grew. So at the time, 1974, as you mentioned in the stats, there were only 28% of the school district was Latino, and now it is 52% and was 57% in 1995. And when Judge Mage in 1995 set aside the desegregation order, he kept the language order. He kept the order that is still in effect today. And so that has now become the consent decree, who we all, read about in the papers. The consent decree was first handed down in 1984, was revised in 1999, was revised again in 2013, and continues to govern and protect the language rights of kids in the Denver public school, who are, as we know, growing. Where they were 8,000 kids in 1984, they are now over 30,000 kids in 2024. So this is I'm talking about 30,000 kids who carry the label English learner. I just want to be clear, not all Latinos are English learners, not all English learners are Latinos. There are 209 languages spoken somewhere in Denver, including common world languages and not so common world languages, but the consent decree thankfully protects them all. We owe that debt of gratitude to the Keys case and to the Keys family being welcoming to plaintiff interveners. A lot of work still to do, including 33,500 new arrivals after October 1st, right, Superintendent?
That's right. Thank you. Pat, what would you like to say?
Well, I would say, if it isn't clear, that the current board has an obligation to desegregate the schools. And there are a lot of ways to do that, which are referred to in the book, but things such as using free reduced lunch or whatever similar metric. If everybody gets a free lunch, then you don't have that to count anymore. But whatever method they use to assess poverty as a basis for setting up your attendance. Or set a floor and a ceiling of the percentage of such students in each school, including charter and magnet schools. Schools could use parental education, single-parent families, housing composition, and zoning for decisions such as admission to competitive programs. Transportation needs to be provided. It's not a choice if you can't get there.
That's right.
It was blacks, whites, and brown and Hispanics trusting each other and working together who successfully brought the Keys case. We don't need another lawsuit, but some leadership from the board and the public to desegregate the schools again.
Buddy, wrap it up for us.
All right. So first we have to make an historical correction. I did say I learned at the knee of Ed Benton. So I have my copy of the Knoll resolution that Ed Benton gave me here. I always have it somewhere. It should be called the Benton-Knoll resolution. My mother and Ed wrote that together. Ed opted not to have his name on it for only reasons that Ed, could convolute everything, but he could tell a rationale why his name shouldn't be on it, but he did so much of the writing. But let's correct the history and call it the Benton-Knoll resolution. Now, in terms of my own thoughts, and you were kind enough to let us conclude with something. I concluded my 50 years of thinking about this in the preface that Pat was so kind to let my sister and I write. So if you haven't read the book yet, hey, start at the preface. And I'm not going to read the whole preface, but I'm going to read some thoughts that were in there that I thought were what Angie and I were really trying to get at. We talked about how consensus, working together, integration in its best use of the term, which brought us here today. It's what brought us together to make the Keys case a reality, to try to make our city a better place. So Angie and I tried to cover that idea, but we also tried to cover the idea from Martin Luther King. Letters in Birmingham. In his letter from Birmingham jail, April 16, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King said, among many other things, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." And that still is with us. Now, it remains to be seen who will step up more. Maybe it's not the fault of the people in this room, but it is the fault of the people that we know, who are apathetic, who are not paying attention to their collective responsibility with us. And maybe it's time that we, once again, marshal the resources that we did back in the day. Keys illustrated the inadequacy of the United Supreme Court's appetite for enforcement since 1954, but it was also a harbinger of the immense white backlash to integration in the schools. That statement addresses two things: the continued white backlash that we experience today, and it continues to question, or at least put in perspective, our reliance on the legal system to solve our problems. It probably won't be this Supreme Court either. You think? America saw the Ku Klux Klan march in Washington in the 1920s. Will we see that again? You know, this faction of American hatred is not the least bit hesitant. We haven't slid as far back as we're going to slide, and our need for resistance is even more necessary. Will a still too silent, unknown percentage of white people rise up and join their black, brown, and other allies to help save the soul of the country, as happened with the Civil War in the mid-1800s or the Civil Rights movement of the mid-1900s? I may be unfairly applying the responsibility, but I do know the order that it comes. I know in a majority society, if the majority doesn't recognize the responsibility, it's damn hard for the responsibility to be met. So I say, finally, the great generation won a world war and passed the civil rights legislation of the mid-1900s. But it will take an even greater generation to turn back Trump and his followers, save our democracy, and fulfill America's true promise. For today's children and tomorrow's, the stakes could not be higher. For today's children and tomorrow's, the battle must be won.
Thank you all so much. That was an incredible panel. I'm going to try to do a really quick overview of DPS 1995 to today, basically. Really high level. I'm gonna skip over some stuff. Some people are gonna have some complaints, I'm sure. But the point is, we got to get to today so we can talk about what now, right? So, as Mrs. Lefkowitz mentioned, in 1995, the district was court ordered to redraw boundaries. They had to because they were in violation of the state constitution, so they redrew their boundaries, right, in 1995. Since then, there has been no thoughtful redesign of boundaries. So schools open, schools closed, there's a shift of boundaries, but no meaningful, let's look at the whole city and say, what should the boundaries look like, right? So the desegregation efforts that the board took in 95, 96 are largely meaningless today. I mean, anybody who's been here for 3 years knows how quickly the city is changing. Certainly, if you go back to 1995, the city is a wildly different place, right? We also had school choice and the evolution of school choice. So the policies around school choice, if there's room and you can get yourself there, you can go to a school, were put in place in 96. We had to move to universal choice, which I think was an improvement in many ways. It moved away from the idea that you had to know somehow when a school's application was going to be or what they wanted on their thing that really favored people with information. But we still have a school choice process that I would argue favors people with privilege. As Pat so eloquently said, if you don't have transportation, is it really a choice? Right? The options that are available to you are limited based on your resources. And so the fact that everybody can participate in the system doesn't mean that everybody has an equal choice. And the district has grown as well, right? We were at around 65,000 kids in 1995. We were about 90. We've started to decline again, as everybody's aware of, one of the hot topics today. And so you would say, well, all right, maybe we like brought some kids back. This seems like a good thing, right? And demographically, the haven't shifted dramatically from 1995 for the district as a whole, right? We've lost some black students for sure. We've lost a few white students. The Latino population, as Dr. Escamilla mentioned, has grown, but we don't have massive shifts in demographics of the schools. But what we do have is a massive growth of segregation, a resegregation of the district, right? So we currently have schools with 96, 97, 98% low-income students, and schools with 10 or 11% low-income students. We have several schools that are 100% students of color, and we have several schools that have 20 or fewer percent students of color. The segregation in the district is massive, and if anybody was paying attention back in, I guess, August maybe, the Latino Education Coalition at the Bueno Center at CU released a report on the resegregation of DPS, and one of the researchers is here, the co-author of that report, who wrote it along with Craig Pena, who was also one of the children plaintiffs in the Keys case. They wrote this report together, and Kim's going to give us a little overview of what they found. So, Kim Strong.
Thank you so much for having me here. And Andrew, as you mentioned, this report was commissioned by the Latino Education Coalition, and I specifically want to thank Milo for protecting this data. He encouraged us to follow the data wherever it led without bias or favoritism. And I would also like to thank the administration of Dr. Marrero for engaging in the study and the findings, even though they're findings that make us uncomfortable and it's not what we wanted to see, but the facts are what they are. To give a little bit of overview about the study and how it was conducted, this is just a snapshot of where we are today. It's not prescriptive saying why this has happened or what we should do now. It's just, this is the state of the district currently. How we conducted the study, just so you know the methods, and I won't spend too much time on this. We looked at the average per school population of students of color and students receiving free and reduced lunch, and we said, let's define segregation as schools that are really far outside of that average, right? We want to account for diversity between schools. We know that not everyone's going to be exactly average, so we created buckets, and we said if on average 79% of students in a school are students of color, if a school has between 63 and 95% students of color, there's no segregation. You have to really be on far ends of deviations from the averages. So we said if you have 95% or more students of color in a school, it's segregated by students of color. If you have 63 or fewer students of students of color in a school, it's segregated by white students. So those are the categories for racial segregation. Likewise, we said if on average 66% of a school receive free and reduced lunch, if a school is between 79% and 52% free and reduced lunch, no segregation by class, right? We know that there's going to be variation across schools. But if a school has 79 or greater percent free and reduced lunch students, we call it segregated by free and reduced lunch. And if it has 52% or fewer free and reduced lunch students, we call it segregated by wealth, by non-free and reduced lunch or class privilege. And so these are kind of our 4 buckets of segregation. And the way we designed the study is we wanted to leave open the possibility that segregation wasn't happening. It's not a fishing expedition. Maybe it wasn't an issue anymore. We designed it to leave open that possibility. That is not what we found. Currently, 80% of schools in DPS are segregated by at least one measure, and many schools are dually segregated. 22% of schools are segregated by both wealth, or the non-free and reduced lunch, and white students, and 28% of students are segregated by both students of color and free and reduced lunch students. We found that schools are not only segregated as deviations from the averages, but extreme concentrations, specifically of white and wealthy students. So on average in the district, 22% of students are white, and we said, well, to be categorized as being white segregated, they have to have more than 37%, like we're giving that wiggle room. In our study, we found that in white segregated schools, on average, 60% of students were white. So to classify, it had to be above 30%, and it's 60%. To classify as schools segregated by wealthy students, they had to have 48% or greater non-free and reduced lunch or wealthy students. In our study, we found that in wealthy segregated schools or schools segregated by wealth, on average, non-free and reduced lunch students were 73% of the student population. So 73% of students in schools segregated by wealth in a district where on average only 35% of students are non-free and reduced lunch. We also found that schools are segregated along multiple axes. It's not just race or class, also unrelated student populations of special education, English learner, and gifted and talented. And we know that these other designations shouldn't reflect racial or class designations, but they very much do. For example, in schools segregated by students of color and free and reduced lunch students, those schools had on average 1.3 times higher special education populations compared to schools segregated by white and wealthy students. In schools segregated by students of color and free and reduced lunch students, on average, those schools had 5 times higher rates of English learners than schools segregated by white and wealthy students. Specifically, in those schools segregated by students of color and free and reduced lunch students, on average, about half of the students are English learners, 45%. In schools segregated by white and wealthy students, 8.5% are English learners. And so we see that it's not just, a racial or class thing, but these other student characteristics. And finally, and this is one of the data points that is distressing to me personally, in schools segregated by students of color and free and reduced lunch students, on average, only 4.5% of students are given talented and gifted designations, which compared to schools segregated by white and wealthy students, where it's 11%. So students attending schools segregated by white and wealthy students are 2.5 times more likely to have their students recognized for having talents. And to be clear, this does not say that Black and brown students are less likely to have gifts and talents. It means they are less likely to have those gifts and talents institutionally recognized. And that is a failure of our school system. What kind of structure? We know that this is not just affecting a few schools or a few students, but the majority of some student populations, specifically Latinos, English learners, non-free and reduced lunch, gifted and talented, and white students. The majority of these students in the district attend segregated schools. About half of Latinos attend segregated schools. Between 50 and 60% of English learners attend segregated schools. Non-free and reduced lunch or wealthy students, 56% attend white segregated schools, and 65% attend schools segregated by wealth. Gifted and talented students, 59% of all gifted and talented students in the district attend white segregated schools, 64 attend schools segregated by wealth, and of white students, 70% of white students in the district attend white segregated schools, and 76% of white students in the district attend schools segregated by wealth, which means if you're walking down the street and you see 4 white DPS students, on average, 3 of those 4 students are attending a segregated school. It's not a small problem just affecting a few students. It's the majority of these student populations. We also know, and I think it's a valid point, that it's not just the numbers that are showing us the quality of education, right? It has a lot to do with the curriculum, the feeling seen and heard and loved, the experience of teachers. So regarding outcomes of students in these segregated schools, when we're measuring 4-year average high school completion rates being a broader metric of success in school than just graduation rates, in every single student category, students could not defy the advantages or detriments of attending segregated schools. So this was true for Black students, Latino students, white students, students of color, free and reduced lunch, English learners, gifted and talented, and special education students. And in every single student category, students in schools segregated by free and reduced lunch and student of color status had lower average high school completion rates than the district average. There's no student category that could defy whatever's happening in these segregated schools. And likewise, in every single student category, students attending schools segregated by white and wealthy students had average 4-year high school completion rates that were above the district average. And so that really exposes the myth of meritocracy. There's no student group that gets beyond whatever's happening or not happening in these schools. For example, across the district, on average, 81% of gifted and talented students complete high school in 4 years. In white and wealthy schools, that jumps to 96, 99%, and in schools segregated by students of color and free and reduced lunch, it drops to 74%. So there's something happening in these schools that is not working for students beyond just the numerical disparities that we're seeing. To conclude, the main points: segregation is pervasive. It's not only deviations from averages, but extreme concentrations of students. Schools are segregated along multiple axes. The majority of some student populations, Latinos, Ls, English learners, non-free and reduced lunch, gifted and talented, and white students attend segregated schools, with 70 to 75% of white students attending segregated schools. And segregated schools reflect disparate achievement outcomes between schools segregated by students of color and free and reduced lunch and those segregated by privileged, white, wealthy status. The difference in average four-year high school completion rates is between 12 and 40 percentage points. 40 percentage points being, 90 to 50. And so these are huge disparities in outcome and really point us, we don't know the causes. This isn't, we don't recommend a policy recommendation, but there's something that's not working in schools and something needs to change.
Thank you, Kim. Perfect. Thank you so much. Think strong. The one thing I just want to put on the table right here, I want to highlight that one more time. 80% of schools in Denver Public Schools are segregated by at least one of these measures. The other thing just to name is that what the research is talking about is the overall student population, which also ignores in-school segregation, right? We know that schools that look desegregated from the outside often are very segregated from the inside, between tracking for honors, AP classes, magnet programs located within schools, et cetera, et cetera. So we're really just sort of scratching the surface of the degree of segregation that's going on. So thank you, Kim, for sharing that, and I'm going to turn over to Mike here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing all that quantitative data. And it just goes to the point that the numbers don't lie, right? Where our affluent white families go, the resources seem to follow. The mindsets of the educators seem to follow. And we know that representation matters so much. Right? We also understand that it has to go beyond just integration. Right? We have to build the capacity of one another to be able to serve children differently and at a higher level. The system in itself is going to bring forth implicit and explicit biases. Because the system tells you you need to dictate and move within it in a certain way if you're an educator. I remember my first year as an AP. I was part of a team that suspended 57 kids. Most that looked like me. And I shared the story of I've dedicated my life to making sure that the babies in our classrooms don't have the same experiences that I had. And even with that mindset, I was part of a team that suspended 57 kids, most that looked like me. So that summer I sat and I had to reflect, and it was my aha moment that I won't do this work if I couldn't do it in a way that aligns with my why. So I shifted. I needed that aha moment. But it's a reminder that the system in itself tells you to walk past white students in the hallway, to go see what the black and brown children are doing. Regardless of your background, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of your socioeconomic status. The numbers don't lie. The resources seem to follow our affluent white babies. So I'm not going to get into the call of action yet, although I want to. But just chew on that. We all said earlier that our babies aren't born with an achievement gap. What are we doing to make sure that we are illuminating the gifts that all of our babies come into these buildings with, not just our white students?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, give it up for that. To that point, to go back to, the 4 things that the Keys case asked for, right? It wasn't just moving kids around. It was desegregation of students and teachers, equalization of resources among schools, elimination of tracking, and racial sensitivity training for teachers. Certainly, the teacher who said, "Here come the bus kids," did not receive a sufficient amount of racial sensitivity training, right? What the district did was fight tooth and nail. And so the thing that the federal government could control was say, let's look at the racial breakdown of each school, we're gonna control it. And the other stuff got pushed to the side. And so what would it mean to do that? What would it mean to take seriously all of those requests from the original Keys case? Data, it's amazing, it doesn't lie. And you may ask, what does it matter? You could reasonably argue, I think, that the adults in the district, it doesn't matter enough for either us as a community or the people in charge to do something about. But it's not really about the adults, right? It's an education system, it's about students. And so it's why we felt it was incredibly important to have a student panel. So I'm very excited to bring up 4 incredible students. Come on up. We have Jade Thompson, Kyrie Romo, Letty Madrigal, and Abraham Munoz. They're going to come up and join us, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. All right, let's start. Let's just go down the road. You maybe each tell us your name and your, where you go to school and grade.
My name is Abraham. I go here at Manual, and I'm a junior.
Yeah. Yeah.
My name is Jade Thompson. I'm also here a student at Manual, and I'm a senior.
My name is Leticia Madrigal Tapia. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm currently in 3rd year at Colorado State University.
Hi, my name is Kyrie Romo. I attend West High School and I am a senior.
So Abraham, to kick us off, I know you have done some work around a professional development for teachers about student voice in curriculum. There are people who will say, you're just students, what do you know? Why should we listen to you? What's the importance of bringing students to the table here?
So yes, I have done some work around the student voice curriculum. I have created 2 policies so far. I have created low enrollment as a product of institutionalized racism, and another policy I collaborated with 3 friends called redefining school choice. We should be listening to these students because we're the ones here 24/7. We're the ones in the building, learning the curriculums, in the classrooms, in the building, just doing what we need to do. Yes, there may be students who are different, who don't care what's going on around them, but there's students like us who are here committed to making a change because we see the flaws and we see the ways we can correct them, because this system and everything else was not made for us to succeed. And yes, I hear every time, you're too young, what do you know? You don't know enough. You don't know enough, but we have the same resources. We're digging deep into the data. I'm here from 8 o'clock to 8:30 at night. I'm here 5 days a week, a long time. But I'm here as much as anyone else. I've learned everything. I'm a student who knows this stuff. I have a lot of leadership roles here. I'm not someone who is just clueless because they want to do something. I want to make a change because it's not just for me. It's for upcoming generations, for my sisters, for my brothers, and my baby cousins. And so I want to make it a better place. I want to improve a lot of things here.
Yes, sir. Leticia, when I turn to you, you graduated from West. Your whole education career was spent in the segregated school system of DPS, predominantly Latino schools, and now you find yourself at a PWI, which I think people usually refer to as a predominantly white institution. Somebody recently referred it to me as a persistently white institution, which I think is a nice way to indicate that that is a choice that institutions make. It is an ongoing choice. It is not a fact of nature. But what has that transition been like? What have you noticed in making that change?
Yeah, I want to separate that question into 2 different experiences because that's 7 years of experience, both in high school at Denver West High School and also at a predominantly white institution. And I guess I want to start with my experience at Denver West High School. I remember when I first learned about segregation and how it impacted students around me and me. I didn't really believe segregation was a thing. I think most of that was because our education systems don't really teach us to have these hard conversations. They teach us that we're there to learn because our teachers are there to teach us, and that's it. They don't teach us to fight a system. They don't teach us that the system wasn't built for us to begin with, and they definitely do not want us fighting those systems, right? And then when I joined Student Voice and Leadership, I think that's where I met one of my favorite teachers, Mr. Wally, right? And he started talking to us about segregating, the segregation of Denver Public Schools. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about my experience as a white Latina compared to my brown brothers, I started to understand how deeply rooted systemic oppression is in these schools and how deeply rooted it was in my experience compared to the experience of my brothers, right? And then I started to think of what used to be Denver West, what is now Denver West High School, what used to be West Early College compared to West Leadership. And West Early College, it went through like 3 different names when I was there because they tried to keep shutting us down and we just refused to get shut down. And the claps, yes, but that also came at the expense of criminalizing and oppressing Black and brown youth from our schools and taking them out of our schools so that they can fit into the stereotypical white standard of white standardized test, right? I remember when they told us that we were higher in standards compared to other schools with more troubled kids, I want to say, which is racist, isn't actually correct. I remember that I was really proud of going to West High School or West Early College. It wasn't what it was then. But then I started thinking, and I was like, well, I saw all these kids who had just as much as potential as me, who were just as intelligent as me, but they got criminalized and I didn't, right? And that was just on West Early College, right? And then you went over to the other side of the building. It was the exact same building, but it was a different school. And we saw how they predominantly focused on English language learners. And how they didn't have the same opportunities that West Early College students did. Because if you went to West Early College, that meant you met the criteria to go and get a higher level education. It meant that by the white standards, you were worthy of it and the other students weren't. And I think that goes into like what students are deemed acceptable and what students are deemed beyond a cause, and we're just gonna send them somewhere else so that we don't have to do it. And our school gets the praise of having good ratings, even though we didn't really do that good of a thing for those students. And I think that experience then shaped my experience of going into a predominantly white institution where I focus on political science, like I said earlier, but I think when people hear political science, all they think about is policy and politics, and let's be real, the state of our politics is not very good right now, and it's kind of really depressing as a young adult to go into those fields. But I remember taking a class in inequalities of education, and I remember everything they were talking about, at least one of my friends experienced it, right? They were talking about the oppression of Black and brown youth, they were talking about the criminalization of Black and brown youth, they were talking about different test scores, who gets on probation, who doesn't, who ends up in the criminal justice system, who doesn't, what's not the justice system, so the carceral system, and who doesn't. And I remember sitting there and I was like, well, I feel like I've lived all these things. These are a reality to me. But to all my white peers, they were just learning about it. Like, and that's like the essence of privilege, where we have to learn, we have to live it for you to have to learn it, right? And it was so disheartening. And I think the more, and now that I'm in my 3rd year, the more I see it, the more I learn it, the more I want to change the system. And obviously attending a predominantly white institution as a first generation, as an immigrant student, and as a Latina, it has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. But I think I wouldn't be who I am now, and I wouldn't be what I want, and I wouldn't want to do what I want to do now if it wasn't for the continuous uplifting of all the teachers at Denver West High School, and actually like seeing the potential that I have in me, regardless of whether, not regardless, but like because of them listening to my voice and listening to the fact that human rights are an issue right now, human rights matters, and education is a human right. And I think if we don't start prioritizing human rights as a whole, we don't start prioritizing teaching our students humanities and also teaching our students how to have empathy for one another, I don't think we're ever going to change for the next generations to come. And that goes with foreign policy, that goes with everything that's going on in the world. And I guess, yeah, those are just some
Kyrie, I want to turn to you. You made sort of an opposite leap. You transferred from Bear Creek, which is what I think about 50% low income, 50% students of color, to West for your senior year. West is currently over 95% both students of color and free and reduced price lunch. Why? What motivated that move, and what did you notice in those two different institutions?
Yeah, so I grew up in Jekyll schools my whole life. And my mom and my dad actually worked at West, and they would always tell me to go to West, and I was just like, no, and I'll stay where I am. But there were definitely like things that I noticed where I just felt alienated, not with me, but also to experiences of my friends. I was mostly friends with people of color. It was visually like everybody there, it was predominantly white, and that was very like an intimidating kind of experience. But I did notice like little things like my freshman year, we had a Black Lives Matter, a small little Black Lives Matter poster in the hallway, and there was like a video of a girl, and she just like ripped it off and then laughed and thought it was funny. And that was like kind of, it set me back a lot. And during like my junior year, my sophomore year, I want to say, we say the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning, and I choose to sit down. That's just what I choose, and that's my right, so I'm allowed to. But I had a teacher come up to me, and she handed me a note sheet, and she was like, do you mind writing down why you don't want to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance? And I never answered her question. And she asked me again the next day, and I just wrote down the case of saying that you don't have to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. And my best friend, who is, she's Black and she's Latina, she got harassed by a teacher every morning almost, was pulled out of class, and, they asked her, why do you choose to sit down? Yeah, well, I have family that's in the military, and it's like, why does that student have to be picked on, especially being a Black student, asking her all these questions, taking time out of her school day. And so, yeah, those were like just some personal experiences. And then also, there was no staff of color. There were 3 staff of color. They were Latinos, and 2 of them were teachers. And I'm very grateful for them. They definitely really helped with my high school experience. And so that was like kind of a thing that I noticed that really, like, I saw no representation. There was no people that looked like me. Who could I go to when I felt this way? And I don't really feel comfortable to run to a white teacher and be like, hey, I feel like personally as a Latina, like, this is how I feel. It's not comfortable for me. But there was no student voice and leadership. There was like a leadership meeting kind of thing, and me and my best friend, we attended it together, and we were the only people of color there. So it's like, why is that the voice of the school, yet who is speaking up for us? So we did try and say our opinion. I did tell them, I was like, you guys are majority white. I feel like you guys don't really have a lot of say on how we feel here in the school. And I got a lot of like pushback, and they were like, no, one kid was like, no, like, my mom is Cuban. And I was just like, girl, like, you're just like me, you look white. And like, that's okay. But, and I received a lot of pushback, and they kind of just didn't really see my point of view. And I was really struggling, like, to really get my opinion out there. And I ended up meeting with those 2 Latino teachers, and we were trying to come up with a club for next year. To try and create something for us, for students of color, for Latinos, for the Black students. And there was, I also experienced this thing with the student who came from Central America. I'm not really quite sure where she came from, and she did not speak English. And she was in my math class, and we would do group work, or we would do an assignment, and she would just sit there in silence, not knowing what to do. And it really broke my heart, because I tried my best to help her, but it's not really my responsibility. I can help as much as I can, but it's not my responsibility. I feel like they should have their own support and someone to help them in class. She was a senior too, and it's like, how do you graduate not having the proper education that you were supposed to receive, not learning any form of English, things like that. So that was just hard. I just felt really alienated, and I got along with my peers really well. I got along with my teachers, as I said, but still I felt like there was something missing. And I would complain to my mom about this, and she was just like, just come. She kind of told me like about West and about Wally, and how Wally has an SBL class. And so yeah, I made a transfer to West, and it was the best thing for me academically, for representation. It felt right. So I'm really glad that I made that move to West. And being in West, I noticed more people of color teachers. Obviously, I noticed people of color students. They're everywhere, you know, so that's bad thing, over 95%. So it was nice seeing people who were like me, had the same similar experiences, could relate to me. And you know, the teachers there, you know, you have some that spoke Spanish, you have some that are Black, you have some that are brown. You see every type. SBL also was a nice foundation for me, student voice and leadership, to really, you know, there was action. I think that's what lacked in my old school, was action. It was that they wanted to say that we had this little thing going, but there was no action. Also at Bear Creek, there was no college prep and things like that. And to me, it kind of seemed like, oh, you know that this is a white population. Their parents probably went to college. You know, there was no students struggling to go to college, to figure out how to apply, to scholarships and things like that. So I think that like moving to West has really like helped with that too. Like they're very focused on that. The secondary education, which is very important and a great opportunity, but that was just my experience.
Thank you. Jade, I want to turn to you. I know you're heavily involved in the theater here at Manual. You seem to be thriving as a thunderbolt, which I won't hold against you. But you know, as Kim's research showed, there are segregated schools in Denver Public Schools. Manual is certainly one of them. 84% low income, 95% students of color here. What's great about Manual, and what are the challenges that come from that segregation?
Okay, the first thing, there's a lot of things that's like amazing with this school. One, I remember my first day, March 8, 2022, when I first came to Manual. Within that first week, I knew like this was home, and I could be myself and like self-advocate, which is like one of the skills that I really appreciated. Because in middle school, I used to go to Aspen Creek, which is in Broomfield, and it's PWI. And I remember one time a student had came up to me and I had my braids in. She would come and like squeeze my braids and be like, "Do you feel that?" I'm like, well, no. But I'm like, there's boundaries that's needed for you to respect me, because I will always be that first person to like respect your personal space and like your culture and like whatever you identify as. And the fact that was allowed within that school with like no consequences, of course it seems small, but that's tradition for me. And my hair is my crown, and that's one of the things that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. And that's why I really appreciate what Manual, not only for respecting me as a person, but respecting us as a community whole. We are one building and we function together, and it's just one of those things that it's what we're proud to represent. And I'm really happy to be here in this building and to know that my teachers, they look like me and they can relate to me in some ways, not having just white teachers. It's just one of those things that it can help you build like your self-confidence and like who you want to be and who you would want to like represent as for your community. And one of the challenges that I think is really hard for people to understand is that we need people that look like us to be there for the change. Like, of course, there's adults that can't help like influence like positivity.
Yeah, what other challenges do you see from the segregation? The fact that Manual is certainly not as enrolled as it would like to be. Are there challenges that come from the segregation of Manuals? And I'll open up that to you as well, Abraham, if you want to jump in.
One of our problems right now is like for buses, for our sports to go to away games right now. And so I think that's one of those factors that it limits us to like enjoy being in school or to like do after school activities. That's something that we're really passionate about. And just we have limited sports that we don't have tennis anymore. I don't think we have a girls softball no more. There's just a lot of sports that's like taken away from us as time went by, and there's like less students that's interested into going into those after school activities.
You want to add anything to that?
Yeah. So one of the big struggles we have here at Manual is funding and resources. We make do with what we have. We try to make it a good school with what we have, and it's amazing. But there's things that we wish we could have, like certain sports. We wish we could have certain clubs. We wish we could go do certain things with classes, but we can't. And so we do what we have, and we make it a great school. We may be a small school, but it's definitely a community here, because everyone knows each other. Everyone respects each other. It's like you're friends with everyone one way or another. You're respected. I've never been hated here. I've always been like, hey, Abraham, good morning, or I've always been said hi to. And so it's just the biggest struggle we have here is just the resources. If you want to go to a school with a community, there's no resources. If you want to go to school with resources, there's no community. And so you have to choose between those. And so it's that sacrifice. And I've always wanted to go to another school, but I won't, because I love Manual and the community here. It always made me feel like home, especially just the friends I have here and everything I do here. I feel home here.
That's beautiful. Why should you have to make that change? Why do you not have board? Anybody want to jump in on that? Just that question in general.
No, that was a perfect example, Adrian. That's exactly how I felt. Bear Creek is a bigger school. It has twice the amount of kids at West, and we typically have more resources. We have more business classes. We have more, we just have a wider class selection and elective selection, and a lot of sports teams. We do get proper funding and things like that, and that's something that since moving to West, I've noticed that they lack, and it's a problem with funding, enrollment, and things like that. So it's hard picking and choosing, because when I moved and I was telling my friends, some of my peers, they were just like, oh, West is ghetto, and since moving to West, I was like, I've seen some more ghetto stuff. That's that Bear Creek for sure. But there's a negative connotation around DPS schools and things like that, and it's sad to see.
Especially adding to that, around segregated schools, there's a lot of negative stigma. As Maggie, we try to eliminate that with social media. We try to post things. We try to eliminate these ideas that people have for our schools, because it's simply not true. It's simply not true. We do so many great things here. We just earned a grant, $50,000 to make a STEM lab from the Broncos. It was very exciting. We do a lot of stuff here. We have theater program. We're doing 2 shows this year. Our basketball boys are doing so amazing this year. These things, it's not that negative stigma. It's so much positive here that people need to know and need to see to finally eliminate that stigma that Manual's ghetto, Manual's a bad school, Manual won't give you the things we have here, because we have college classes here. A lot of our students take college classes here, concurrent enrollment classes here, and that's a good thing that we have here. We really need to eliminate that negative stigma. Yes?
When you talk about Manual and resources, can you talk a little bit about what happened with the ROTC program?
Yes. So,
He's a plant.
So yes, we did have a JROTC program here. That's actually one of the policies I created in student voice leadership. It's a low enrollment as a product of institutionalized racism. So we had a colonel. He came, I believe, the second year I joined ROTC. Our first sergeant, he was black, and the colonel, he was white. He written up our first sergeant 15 times in that 1 year. Out of his whole 15 years, that was the most he's ever been written up, and he's never been written up before. And then they took away ROTC and they gave it to Northfield, a predominantly white school, more richer, wealthier neighborhood too. And we are a small school, so we really can't build the class sizes. Everyone's going somewhere else. But the 2 rules that you had for ROTC was you had to have 100 students in the class, or you had to have 10% of the population, of the student population, enrolled into the class. We had 10% of the student population, because back then we were barely a school of 200 something, barely making it by. So how are we supposed to get 100 students into a class when everyone else is interested in other things? But they still took away our program, give it to a wealthier neighborhood, and so now we were left. And so that's the thing with the resources, we lose a lot of things, and it takes away from our student experience, our high school experience, and that's the thing that I want to experience in high school, and that's what Manual's been doing with just my friends and students here.
All right, you are all so inspiring. In just sort of a closing from each of you, we've been talking, we started the day talking about the ripples. that the choices that impacted Mike and I, that impacted so many kids, and shaped our lives in so many ways. Is there a message, something that you would want to leave for all these adults in the room here about what you want us to do in order to have a similar sort of ripple that might affect the rest of your lives?
It's not more of what I want you to do, it's a question I have for you, I've written it down earlier, is who we talk about not wanting to talk about it and want to make more change, but is it the adults that are gonna make the change, or is it the students that are gonna make the change, or is it gonna be both of us? Because we have SBL teams, we have leadership things here, and we're committed to making change. We're creating policies, we're creating, implementing stuff for other schools, taking this to school board members, presenting it at other things. As a community, we could be collaborating together instead of just one-on-one. It could be a collaboration of both. And I ask you, the question is, will you connect with us and collaborate with us?
Jay, what do you want us to leave with?
I'd like to also go off what Abraham said. We're still kids, whether that. Just because we turn 18 doesn't mean that we're able to just go off on our own and just solve it by yourself. We're trying to finish school, and there's all these stigmas that says, oh yeah, finish with good grades, be involved in school. However, we can do all that, but how are we able to function mentally and physically to make sure that we live up to society standards? What more do you expect for us at just starting freshman year? What else do you expect for us as time go by? And then also just make sure being aware of what's going on within your community can also bring awareness. Just spreading the word alone can make a huge impact, not only in your own household, but also for your community around you. It's we're trying to make sure that we're doing the best for ourselves. And we can't be doing that alone to make sure everyone is satisfied and that everyone can be, comfortable with what we're doing with our own self. Because we all have personal goals that we would like to accomplish one day. And then there's just a lot of other pathways that can distract us from, getting to that certain goal. Everyone's voice matters. And I think that some people forget is that yes, it is your voice alone. However, if you and others agree that as a group that y'all can make that impact as well, that would be very helpful.
Letty, what do you want to leave us with?
I guess I'm considered a young adult now. So I think attending a predominantly white institution and attending white academia, I think they center themselves so much on freedom of speech. And yes, I agree, everyone has an opinion, everyone has the right to say what they feel and say their opinions, quote unquote. But I think as we head into this new election, I center myself on how much tolerance are we willing to accept, and at what point do we stop tolerating so much bigotry, right? Because yes, you have the right, I guess I'll let you guys stop. Because yes, you have the right to say what you feel and your own opinion, but your opinions shape the policy and shape our future. And I don't mean you guys, I just mean as educators, you guys.
Us too.
Okay, if you want to take it. I kind of almost struggled. But yeah, I think I just want to leave it off as stop tolerating so much bigotry, because we each as individuals have the right to how much we tolerate. And the minute we stop tolerating the dehumanization of all of us, that's the minute we actually stand up and fight for our own liberation.
I know we're here because, it's about integration and equity, but we were discussing at my table that integrated does not equal equal. It does not equal equality. I guess some would consider my old school, I guess somewhat integrated because we were 50-50, but that's just not how things are. And to have an integrated school and to have an equal school is to have all resources shared across the board, period. There shouldn't be a reason for some schools to lack a significant amount of resources. And I think that we should remember that we can integrate as much as we can, but we need to make sure everybody has an equitable education to have the same resources.
One more thing I want to leave you guys with. Just because we're students doesn't mean our experience is less valuable than anyone else's. I feel like it's more valuable because we're the ones in the schools and in the buildings. That's all I'm going to leave you with.
Yeah. Thank you all. You're incredible. You will definitely be hearing from all of them in the future, I'm sure, and we're just so grateful to you all for coming and participating in this conversation. Thank you. So I'm gonna pass it back to Viola.
I told Andrew, I'm inspired by them and should not be. Because the things I'm inspired about is the things that they are doing that we should have done, right? So I shouldn't be inspired by them doing the work that we should be doing.
We are taking, a bit of time here and not long, and the key question is, you let us right into it. What are you sitting with right now? And we want to have, anybody in the audience. So pop up, speak. Laura's writing these down.
I'm Britt, and I was sitting over there. But I was a teacher and I work as a therapist at DC 21. And so the thing, I believe it was Kyrie who shared her first school kind of was integrated and looked integrated, but that her experience was so much better in a school that was by metrics, segregated. And I think to all of Kim's amazing, incredible data, I think it's really nuanced of maybe there's value in having in schools where kids can see themselves and feel heard and have communities that look like them, but how are we making sure that those end metrics are still turning out well, right? So the graduation rates are good and the college completion rates are good and all of those things. I think that's maybe more what some of that focus should be, because I think to Kyrie's point, there's a ton about, and to the manual kids, Jade and Abraham, it's I so appreciate everything that y'all shared, and there's value in being in a community where your peers look like you, and I don't, as a white woman with white kids in the district, I don't want to take that away, and I think that's really important, so thanks, that's all.
Hi, I'm Janelle Williams, and just a brief comment. It was very disappointing to hear about the resources at this school, and what I find is I currently work in housing. I work for the Warehousing Authority, and we receive federal funds and such. And what I find is there is a wealth of resources coming through, but there's usually crooks at the top. Mismanagement of money and things like that are not a priority. So you really need good, strong leadership at the top to make sure these funds are adequately distributed. Also I wanted to say that I believe that education is absolutely a right, but quality education. We need quality education. So that was one thing. And I also wanted to mention that I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. And I was bused out of my neighborhood, and while it was a wonderful experience for me, it basically made the person that I am now a well-rounded person. Exactly. And I can appreciate that experience, and I had my first white teacher in elementary school, and when I tell you that situation changed my life. She was wonderful to me. All of a sudden, I had a teacher who was not overworked and underpaid. So she was very important and teaching me that my situation did not determine who I was. I was not a victim, no matter where I grew up, and just teaching me those things. And so basically, that was my input. That it's very important to give these kids a quality education. And education is not enough. They need a quality education. Thank you.
All right, probably time for one more. What are you sitting with? Anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I would just say I'm so pleased to be here, grateful to everyone for putting it on. And I would also ask that we have this conversation in an educational setting frequently. Where else do we need to have it? What other parts of our communities do we need to be talking about this? The schools and our education system can't fix everything everywhere. Thank you.
That was amazing. I know there's been a lot of material, a long time. The chairs are not comfortable, but everybody hung out and went through it. I think that's amazing. A couple of things, just some business before we wrap up. The student voice and leadership, all the students are presenting their policy proposals on April 26th. You can check the DPS website, there'll be more information, but if you were inspired and potentially also troubled by being inspired by the student voice we heard today, that'll be an amazing event. You should definitely go check that out. We would be really grateful for your support. This event obviously was, took resources to put on. We are an all-volunteer organization at PHNEE, and so your support is really helpful. In addition to putting on events like this, which I guess our last one was in 2018, so it's not like a super regular occurrence, but we also do direct giving to the schools in Park Hill. Our focus is really the elementary schools in Park Hill, so we do direct giving. We know that the fundraising capacity of the schools in Park Hill is wildly different from school to school, and so we do some direct giving. We also do some events. You see on your tables there's some wristbands. Those are from our One Park Hill Day. It's an annual event now that we bring all of the third graders from the schools together for a day of learning to break dance and having lunch together and just sort of building community. We've got a website, PHNEE.org, PHNEE.org, and other sort of communication work. So whatever you can give to help support that work, we would be very grateful. We're about to have lunch. When you go out to get lunch, you'll see some community tables. There's some amazing community partners who we have worked with on various things in the past. They are here supporting the community, and so go out and check them out and learn about them. WellPower, Sims Fayola, the DPS Black Family Engagement, Integrated Schools, Chic, Apprentice of Peace, and Fit New all have tables out there. Go and learn about them, support them. They're really incredible, awesome organizations. One more thanks, Manual High School for having us. The facility services crew here is just great. They've been really lovely to us. I know Chris Dreamer, the principal, was around. I think he may have had to step out, but it's a pleasure to be in such a historic location for having this important conversation. Again, thanks to Holland and Hart. Ed Kahn is here. He was a partner at Holland and Hart at the time. We can give a round of applause to Ed. He wanted me to mention it is important to know that Holland and Hart took on the case at a time, they took on the Keys case pro bono, first of all. And they did it at a time when they were really the only organization that could and was willing to do it. So they fought the case for 25 years, all pro bono. They lost clients because they took the case. And they really set a standard for what other law firms in the city should do when it comes to doing the right thing, when it comes to getting on the right side of history. And so they were also generous enough to help support this event. So we're really grateful to them for the work with Keys and for their help today. So let's hear it for all of our speakers that we've heard from, just such incredible people. One big round of applause for all of the speakers. The planning committee who helped put this whole thing together. If you're on a planning committee, raise your hand. We need lots and lots of late night Zooms to put all of this work together. Elizabeth has been doing sound. At some point I thought that maybe we wouldn't need anybody. She's got a lifesaver. Current senior at East High School, Angels in the house. But mostly thank you to all of you for showing up. Right, you took time out of your Saturday. It's snowy, it's cold, you could have been doing anything else, and you're here, you've engaged in conversation. We are deeply grateful to you for doing that. So what are we hoping you take away from today? Mike?
I think that is up to you, right? Absolutely, I think that is up to you. I think we've heard from people who have put their livelihood on the line, their lives on the line, all for the betterment of our babies, all for what we call our most prized possession, our kids. Again, inspired by the voices of kids, where oftentimes they're right in front of us and we never ask them, what's your opinion? So oftentimes we're not doing school with babies, we're doing it to them. And me, that's the narrative I'm walking away with. So you have to find and define your own narrative and what you're walking away with. I will say that the conversation needs to extend beyond the walls of our education settings. And they need to extend beyond conversation. So you need to ask yourself, what skin do I have in the game? And what is my own purpose and call to action to make sure that these babies are lifting up the mountains that we said we would lift up for them. All right, thank you for being here. Once you serve out in the hallway,